So thank you again. So I just wanted to get the discussion started by asking some of my panel members here that we know that open source has been around for a great while, right? And it's also gone mainstream into adoption. So how do you see that technology being played out currently, where there's the talk of digital convergence, there's the talk of autonomous cars and autonomous vehicles. So where do you see open source playing out specifically in the context of interoperability? Sridhar, would you like to?
Sure.
Yeah.
So let me take a first stab. So the thing is, of course, throughout the day, we repeatedly keep hearing that we cross from one wave to another wave to another wave, right? And we are at a point where the acceleration is happening really fast. I'll give what I'm seeing in the industry as well as our personal experiences with some of our clients. So we reached a point where people cannot build a product that works in isolation because customers, be it enterprises or the consumers, they're trying to put the jigsaw puzzle pieces together themselves. So whatever you're building, even the good old Microsoft that used to build all the jigsaw puzzles, so that world has changed now. Whatever you're building is fitting as a piece. It has to work with a lot of other pieces. So everybody realized, and they have to actually use interoperability so that it is easy for enterprises to put the pieces together because nobody has 1 year IT budgets to put these pieces together. I buy 4 products, I expect them to work in the next 2 months or 1 month, right? So to accelerate the innovation and to achieve higher degree of interoperability, even the giants have to selectively open source. So just to add to the examples you mentioned, Apple is forced in a way strategically to outsource or open source WebKit, right? That is the only way in which they can get the browser market, achieve the highest level of interoperability with the web standards, and they had to do it. That's one example. Very similarly, we worked with Microsoft on another example where Microsoft Azure is one of their biggest cloud platforms. Non-Microsoft shops are not trusting it as much as Microsoft shops because there's AWS. So do I have Ruby SDK? Do I have Java SDK to Microsoft Azure? And what Microsoft has done, and we worked with them on the engineering, is to actually build the SDKs in non-Microsoft languages in open source model so that the acceleration is fast and adoption is much higher.
Got that. Alex, I have a question for you. We just spoke about Apple building the WebKit, and it's almost like an afterthought. They initially didn't start open source, right? They were pretty much a closed source company. Open source in terms of WebKit and for Microsoft also is more a recent phenomena. It, in fact, has started coming in when these companies are shifting from being mere product companies to being platform and solution companies. So in the context of lithium, how do you see that playing out? Do you make open source and specifically interoperability as a core part of your product strategy, or is it something which you still consider to pick up, in some point of time?
Yes. So I want to say we're a pretty big user of open source technologies. Most of our platform it's a SaaS platform, and most of it is sitting on top of open source technologies. And so as maybe I should tell a little bit about what we do, and then in that context, I'll explain how open source plays the role in our company. So we help companies connect with their digital customers on social channels, and our products vary from on-domain communities to social listening, response, and publishing platform, as well as engagement analytics on social channels. So we provide customer communities and ways for brands to engage with their customers on social channels via various products. And as a result, in these products, we have some APIs that customers can use to integrate with our platform. We also provide social scores for influencers on the social web, as well as we provide data from social influencers via APIs to many companies, sometimes at cost and sometimes at no cost. So our way of contributing to open source is we open source some of the components on our platform to make it easier for companies to integrate with us. And when companies do integrate with us and create additional functionality within their platform, they open source those components. So we kind of get this developer community contributing to our platform that way. I don't know if that kind of explains. But
it does. Vince, actually, I wanted to ask you, because a lot of the work that you do at Technicolor is also focused on the media devices. So you have set-top boxes, and there are a lot of standards that operate in that paradigm. There is no clear winner sometimes in terms of how the technology evolution is going to take shape and who's going to be the last winner in terms of defining the standards and the community around it. In such a paradigm, which is very dynamic, how do you define what the next phase in terms of technology adoption is going to look like, and how do you prepare your workforce to deal with that dynamic shift?
Yes, it's a pretty challenging. It's a pretty challenging environment for an area, something like say the Internet of Things as a good example, where you've got a clear need for interoperability between devices, data models, different forms of connectivity, messaging. And so you've got a range of technologies you've got to invest in at either the software development phase or just simply how you're going to develop the individual components of the operating systems of the boxes and so on. And the fact that if you look into IoT, you'll probably see more interoperability standards than it's possible to interoperate between. So there clearly is a business model problem as much as there is a technology problem. And when you get into the situation of, okay, now I have to make choices about my technology stack that allow me to have velocity of innovation, that I can actually develop a low-cost set of products and solutions. But I also know the business models are going to be somewhat vertical in some way. We can talk about Amazon and what they might do, or Nest and Google, or we can talk about Apple. Each of the different companies having certain business model objectives about how they want to see interoperability work. But I've got to make products, so they're going to work with all of them potentially. So how do I make choices? Well, ultimately, those things do come down to looking at the cost, right? So there are certain choices you make around a technology standard, say like MQ, or
for some reason your mic is...
Yeah, I didn't think you were hearing me. I don't know how much I have to say that again. It's all good. Just to cover back a couple of the topics that I mentioned, I do think you've got a range of business model choices and challenges that in any particular business, like say Internet of Things. The velocity of innovation is very important. So you do want to make open source choices that increase your potential for interoperability because you're working with a larger base of potential partners. But then you do recognise that where success in the marketplace may could come from particular business models, and if you make those choices. Inevitably, this is one of those big company decisions. You make the decision to go down a particular business model path. You select certain open source and interoperability standards on the base of that. And if you're wrong, hopefully you've got some of the building blocks right. So you build up from the confidence level where the building blocks can be that you're reducing your risk. We had one technology base, as an example, developed about 25 million lines of code of our own to work within a number of different open source communities. It still was about another 200 million lines of code coming from open source. And we were able to make sure that through those choices we made on those different open source communities, we had interoperability with about 4 different business models. So, you could still make choices. You could hedge your bets a little bit. Yeah, absolutely.
So, Vipin, your company is almost a startup by itself, right? I mean, you have 30 people you mentioned, and you're building products as we speak. In your specific context, unlike Vince's, where they can actually hedge their bets by investing in 4 different types of platforms or technologies and see who stays back at the end of it. How do you deal with such a problem where you don't know what's going to last long and what's the hype cycle through which it's going through? So how do you take a call on that?
So maybe I should give a context of scalable. We build hyper-converged appliances which are designed from grounds up. So we eliminate all the bottlenecks to maximize performance and density. And with the big data era now, you want to work with increasing amount of data with less time to get the analytics on that. So we use a lot of open source software in our appliances, and the particular software that we use is actually dictated by our customers. The customers are pushing us for open source solutions. And if I can add to the interoperability bit, I wanted to extend the concept of interoperability from just the functionality of things working together, rather to metrics. For example, performance is a metric for us. So we deal with very complex open sources like operating systems, distributed parallel file systems, object stores, and so on. And if a customer wants a certain performance, well, you got to pick the right open source solution as part of the entire ecosystem to be able to deliver that metric of interoperability. But it's mostly dictated by what the customers want.
Sridhar, I wanted to pick up your brains in terms of understanding. You've seen so many companies operating, adopting open source, some small, some mid-sized, some large, from different industry verticals. Where do you think open source adoption plays out really well in terms of transforming the way the products or the solutions of the companies are built out? And where do you still see some type of industries having bottlenecks in delivering those solutions?
Sure. Just to give a little perspective to the statement that the experience we had, right? We have a large open source practice because we work with many of our customers on their engineering next generation solutions, and we have 800 plus size open source practice. So that way, from the hardware embedded all the way to the cloud, we have exposure and experience working on their engineering problems. So with that as a background, what we are seeing is, of course, historically, most of our customers used to use smaller components as part of their overall solution. Like it was very straightforward for many people to use Spring Framework or certain tools and components 5-6 years back, but anything very core powering their solution generally is in-house developed. So we reached a point where the trust on the open source has gone up significantly higher in the product engineering space, and most of the customers we are working with are very open to accept open source solution as the backbone of their solution. For example, one of the customers, movietickets.com, for them, message flow is the fundamental thing for their entire solution, because the movie tickets can be purchased from the mobile device or web or from the devices at the theaters, and they're willing to use open source as their messaging backbone. So there are quite few examples like that where people are using API gateways or messaging backbones, or in some situations using their SDN software when they're building VoIP solutions. And these are like the core of their solution, right? And that way, the acceptance of open source is extremely higher at this point in time. And the choice of the open source is, again, dependent on how interoperable that particular component with the rest of the pieces is. So that being said, in terms of the acceptance, the additional parameter I would like to add is, if your software is hosted, if you're trying to deliver your product or a platform in a SaaS model, it is much easier because you're not shipping your software, right? Especially when you are getting into shipping your software in the licensed mode, be it the software layer added on top of the hardware that you're shipping to your customers. So in that case, I'm sure Vipin can add more from their personal experience, then the licensing nightmares come into picture, right? Yeah. But in the SaaS model, it is pretty straightforward and a lot more acceptance is there.
Got it. So Vince, going back to the point that I can actually share the mic with you.
We can get an open source mic.
Yeah. Sridhar just mentioned that, there are more challenges for a non-SaaS-based product, which is both hardware and software integrated. And I would assume that a set-top box would, emulate some of that kind of workflows as well. So how do you deal with those challenges? What are your plans to mitigate such challenges?
Sure. So management of the open source licensing environments is a pretty active investment that we need to make. It's something we're constantly tracking, even through the course of something as messy as an acquisition, going down to that level of detail of understanding exactly each piece of open source software that might exist in the products that are being sold, and therefore understanding what the licensing inconsistencies might be if we incorporate that. In one case, literally through an acquisition, using a holding company type mechanism to transfer the IP rights through so that we didn't take on board some of the licensing obligations that would otherwise have been incurred. So it is, when you're in the product business, absolutely critical, but not all of what we do is product. So it's clear virtually every device these days you attach some form of microservice or software as a service component. Clearly we then incorporate a lot of the software tools that we can using open source. And even as we describe here, there's a lot of interoperability of data that needs to flow to make things work end to end. And our business has been largely predicated on interoperability, whether it's things like HDMI so that you can have confidence to connect any device to any screen, or even Wi-Fi. In theory, it's all 802.11 type technologies, but until you actually have certification of the interoperability through a Wi-Fi certification, you don't know it works. So you still need to take any of these licensing models, understand how it's going to suit your combination of product and service. Very, very rarely you're just doing a product alone, and then look at the business model associated with how you're going to distribute it.
Alex, I have a question for you. So if open source is the way forward for interoperability, and it's going to be a large part of product development lifecycle, what type of programs and processes do most organizations need to put in place to be able to enable this transition? How do you see that playing out?
Good question. So I think...
Is he audible?
No.
No?
Okay.
Microphone?
I can pass it.
So I guess I'll speak from what we've been experiencing at Lithium as far as kind of our open source journey, and also I think it has something to do with our journey to cloud and container world. So what we've done is we matured our open source platform that runs behind the scenes, where our applications run on top of. What we ended up doing, abstracting some of this open source, so we ended up putting our own layers on top of some of this open source projects. So, for example, our developers don't have to interact with them that much. That's just been done because as we had developers join the teams, there was quite a bit of a learning curve on some of these open source projects. So we ended up, to speed up development and enable more or faster development lifecycle, we ended up writing some of the layers on top of this open source. What we've also seen is that as some of this open source projects matured, some of the founders kind of spun off enterprise support branches of this open source projects and added some availability and monitoring tools around this open source projects, and started kind of selling them as a commercial enterprise product, so per se. And so we ended up mitigating risk by kind of going towards some of these kind of enterprise open source support offerings and implementing them within our enterprise. So some examples would be Cloudera is something that we use. So we have Cloudera support. It's pretty expensive, but it is worth using, because I think in the end it comes down to, probably in our case, we would need 3 Hadoop engineers to maintain. We have a 7 petabyte Hadoop cluster that processes our social data. And so we need about 3 full-time engineers to kind of maintain that and keep it going if it wasn't Cloudera. Cloudera is probably pricing of 1 headcount, and you get enterprise support. It's 24/7. They give you a bunch of automation and management tools with that. So we've kind of been following the same path with Elasticsearch is a pretty big footprint in our setup, as well as Kafka. And so those are kind of 3 technologies. Obviously, MySQL is Oracle, so there you kind of have to get into that whole game. But we've been using Percona, which is it's not Oracle. It's a smaller company, and it's based off of, for example, founders of MySQL went and started this company, and they created their own distribution, and now they fully support both Oracle's MySQL and their own. So the journey that we've had is kind of going from trying to support this open source projects that Power Platform ourselves, and realizing that it's actually more cost effective to get a third party, like Confluent or Sematext or Elasticsearch or Cloudera, to give us that open source support at scale.
as well as kind of getting into the cloud realm, what we've also seen is that, for example, Amazon has been abstracting a lot of these open source projects and providing them as a service. So we're seeing kind of some of open source platforms that we run, what we host ourselves and support, even with support of third-party partners. We're starting to see a transition where we're, for example, as we have a lot bigger Amazon footprint today, we're starting to leverage some of the Amazon native services more and more, because it's pretty much the same open source projects, just Amazon put a nice API on top of it, and it abstracts all the management, and it's a lot cheaper to actually use those services rather than run it all yourself.
Actually, I just want to add one point, because that's very valid for this group, is open source is not free, right? And so some of the enterprise support that you had to take, right, which is perfectly, you talked only from the cost angle, but we had an experience where one of the VoIP companies was using Open Daylight without having much understanding about how to use it. And once they start getting into issues, right, at least you could have 3 engineers and you're spending cost. But in their case, they just lost time to market window. So the whole project had to be delayed by approximately 4 to 6 months. So the point I want to make is open source is not equal to free. Even this never came up with the conversation, but just I want to stress on that. And whatever is the tools or the frameworks that are being chosen, need to assess, can I afford to have in-house engineers that can support it, or at least there's an enterprise support. So
yeah, I think some of our lessons learned is also looking at the maturity of the open source project and how big the community is behind it. We've had some interesting challenges with Open Contrail that kind of powers our software-defined networking for our OpenStack, which we run on premise. And it's a Juniper-supported project, and Juniper is all in. But again, it's kind of a early on technology. There's of course issues there, and we have great relationship with Juniper, but once again, it's at enterprise scale where you need high uptime and availability. And Juniper is trying to kind of create the standard, and they're pushing it out there. And while it's better than some of the other ones, it's still very early on. And so one of our lessons learned was, with this type of early on projects, you just got to be careful, even if you get full-time support from somebody like Juniper. So it's kind of a hit and miss. Maybe our lesson learned is just going to try to stay away from some of these kind of early on technologies.
Alex, I have a question for you. I want you to hold the mic for 1 more minute. I hope I'm audible enough. My question to you is that, in the open source paradigm, especially with interoperability, there are so many new frameworks and technologies coming on, and things change pretty dynamically. How do you ensure that you have the right skill sets? Because even if you use a third-party tool, you still need your people to be aware about those technologies and know how to work with them. How do you make sure that the relevancy of the skill sets within your organization is there, and that you're always prepared to, even if there's a technology shift, you're prepared to handle that?
Great question.
So we've tried many different things. Training obviously is an obvious one. Kind of investing in training your team.
Have you seen the training investment go up, or how does that?
Slightly. It wasn't very fruitful for us, for example. I want to say hire good engineers. We've had engineers that we've hired that some were able to kind of get into the specific open source technology that we use and start contributing to the open source of that technology. That was kind of one of the requirements that I usually put on job descriptions, is I want to hire somebody that is already contributing to some kind of open source projects. So it's kind of a built-in into their day-to-day is, whatever I'm working with, I want to be able to contribute back to the community. I'm interested in working with open source, and so I think it's just kind of building the culture of the team, of the company, is working with open source and contributing back. A lot of people I don't want to say everybody at Lithium is like that, but we have a lot of people that are kind of contributing back to the community continuously. It's good for them, good for their personal career development, and it's also good for Lithium's visibility, and obviously it's helping out the community. So it's helping Lithium to stay on top of the technology and helping out the community. So it's more like encouraging your developers to be more active in the open source scene. So yeah.
Do you see that playing out in Scalable as well, where you're seeing that you're increasingly hiring people with the job description that they have an open source background, they're part of the community?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to be part of the community. There are lots of open source projects out there, and someone has to figure out what makes sense for that particular domain. So if you have people who are participating in these communities, who are active in those communities, that not only helps you decide what to use, how they interoperate, but also to be able to support. Because we sell appliances, we need to support all of the stack. And so we have to be very careful in getting the right people who are very embedded in these open source communities.
I'll add something to this. We encourage our engineers to contribute to open source, but we also, anytime we're faced with a choice of, do we build this tool or do we build this piece of software ourselves, or do we contribute back to the open source project that we already have that maybe doesn't do everything that we need, but there's a specific feature we're trying to add. I think we're trying to steer towards let's kind of narrow down the open source projects that we're using internally, and let's just continue contributing to those open source projects when it's not our core product functionality. So that's kind of, in the past, I think we used to just build a bunch of our own tools and not actively seek out, what's open source doing, or what are the plans for this open source project? Is there something that something that we're trying to build kind of coming down in their pipeline, and kind of working actively with those open source contributors in the community. So we're steering more towards, let's just make this open source project successful and kind of collaborate with the community.
Vince, in your industry, when we specifically talk about interoperability, do you feel that interoperability is going to push more open source adoption? Because when you're talking about disparate systems, processes, platforms, even people and devices, how do you get them all together if you're not already adopting open source? Do you see that there is a way that proprietary platforms or standards can coexist when interoperability is one of the fundamental challenges that we are gunning to solve in the digital world?
I think that it does come down to the business model of the service that you're trying, or product you're trying to offer. You could argue a good example comes through the way in which Apple is being successful with using Siri to drive people to incorporate HomeKit into their IoT type products. So if you want Siri to work with your app and your device, then you've got to incorporate HomeKit, and that's really, it is Apple's model. It's sort of open source. It's not really, but basically, if you want to serve that community, you want the user interface to be as clean, as neat as using Siri to say turn on the lights, then you've got to work with HomeKit. So that drives decision making, and as far as I'm concerned, that's perfectly okay. That's decisions you make in your business model about how you want to address a certain market. So there's always going to be some balances. Open source is not free. It's a community that allows you to have velocity of innovation, allows you to address a market, allows you to tap into a development pool, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of reasons you make open source decisions. Interoperability is one of them, and interoperability does come from how you want to address a market.
Mm-hmm. So Sridhar, when you build out solutions for your customers and they speak about interoperability, where do you see them navigating towards? Are they shifting the balance more towards open source technologies, or things are as they used to be?
So I think it was touched earlier. The first thing pretty much everybody's asking at this stage is we need to have open APIs. So at this point in time, 99.99% of the products and the platforms that are being built are having open APIs. So that is the first step, right? So that at least programmatically you can stitch and you can interoperate with others. The second criteria is, are there well-established open standards? So when there are well-established open standards, pretty much a closed system with open API is working out pretty well. So the third decision-making criteria is, are there some components which are in the glues area, do I need to open source it so that I can actually get more of the community acceptance and better interoperability rather than only through my partner program. So the last one is, if you are very small, right, and if your business model requires, go complete open source. If at all you want a lot of interoperability with your solution, like we are working with OnLabs, and they make actually SDN operating system, and the standards are not really stable, and they are fighting with giants in that space, right? And in that case, they wanted the entire stack to be open sourced. Right. Eventually, they may want to build some specializations on the top of it as enterprise flavor, or build support models around it. So very few are having the complete courage to go open source if their business model supports. Everybody is going for APIs. Some are pushing the glue components into open source model. I don't know what the experience of others is.
Would you agree, most of you?
Yeah.
So I know we are running a bit out of time, but I just want some closing thoughts. So I mean, one message that you would like to give out to enterprises who are looking to solve the interoperability challenge, either through open source or using proprietary platforms. Any closing thoughts on how they should go about doing that? Maybe one major thought, main takeaway that you would like to give them.
I would say narrow down the scope of
how many open source projects you're leveraging for your products,
and make sure that you have those projects actually have a large community and fairly established enterprise support.
Vipin, would you like to add?
So yeah, I think one component we didn't touch about in open source where it has really worked very well is in security. So if you see all the security standards, the codes, they're all open source. And because of that, you're able to evaluate the correctness of those. And we are seeing that same flavor in other open source projects as well. So you would expect that open source projects would be more stable because there are lots of people looking at that. And I think that's something which is really positive for open source.
Sridhar, you want to add something?
So 2-3 points to always look at is think about the ecosystems, because at this point in time, nobody's an island, everything is an ecosystem. So think about the ecosystem in which your product is going to participate. Think about the openness that you want to build into that, and open source is a vehicle if you want to use it.
Coming last, it's easy just to build on everything, which was all true, but I would just come back to a point made earlier by Vipin, which is the licensing rules. You really, you have to read the fine print. You just have to be certain that what you're doing isn't going to be completely in contradiction to the business model you're going to depend upon, because all the other things could be criteria that you're happy with, and then define that actually you cross some line on a core part of what you're trying to do, and you really shouldn't be using that piece of software. And that's kind of late if you've gone a long way down the path of developing everything and define that at the end. So it's not necessarily a legal thing, but just make sure you read the fine print.
Thank you. Very interesting insights from the panel. Before I get them off the stage, are there any questions for them? Yeah.
Drinks.
All right.
Drinks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now it works.